We saw how in the last video, Nintendo had some connections to the Bush family, even through Gorton and others. The Mario cartoons even had a Mr. President character who Super Mario Wiki says appears to combine elements of George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. In the Adventures of Super Mario Bros. 3 episode, Reptiles in the Rose Garden, the White House gets taken to Darkland, and Mario eventually returns it to Washington, D.C. So, Mario saved the Bush era White House from Bowser. In the arcade version of Nintendo's Bad Dudes, the kidnapped president was President Ronnie, a Reagan joke. But the NES version changed it to the president. And retro gaming sources note that he was changed to resemble George H.W. Bush since Bush was president when the NES port came out. On the other side of the political aisle, Nintendo was also connected to Senator Lieberman, partly through Gorton and Kaplan. Nintendo may have even leaned more strongly to the political left. We saw Lieberman working behind the scenes with Kaplan, while Perrin Kaplan, the former vice president of marketing and corporate affairs at Nintendo, is widely cited as having managed political communications for White House campaigns. Her public biographies do not explicitly name the specific presidential candidates she worked for. However, she likely leaned Democrat, given that a public contribution listing has Perrin Kaplan / Nintendo giving $200 to Cantwell 2006 on January 24th, 2003, and $250 again on May 2nd, 2003. Maria Cantwell is a Democrat U.S. Senator from Washington. Kaplan's pre-Nintendo career path also fits a Washington state Democrat public affairs ecosystem more than an obvious Republican one. Her DICE bio says she worked for the Washington State Department of Ecology, Washington State Senate Communications staff, and the Rocky Company before joining Nintendo in 1992. That does not prove party loyalty, but environmental public affairs, plus Seattle and Olympia Communications, as well as the later donations to Cantwell, lean left. She also read Kamala Harris's book and called it interesting enough. Doubtful. Nintendo also approved a Bill Clinton game around this time in the early 90s. It was a platformer where Socks, Bill Clinton's real-life pet cat, is the hero. It was called Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill. On SNES, nothing shipped or reached the stage of widespread press previews without Nintendo's approval. Ann McDonald, who worked on the game at Real Time Associates, says the game was complete. The game was never released. Kaneko Japan chose not to produce it when Kaneko US was closed. The game did clear Nintendo and was complete. No known copies exist. David Warhol, the owner of Real Time Associates, said, "Yes, we developed and completed Socks Rocks the Hill for SNES. SNES Central reports, Nintendo Power had a short preview in the May 1994 issue. In it, they state that the content might be considered a bit controversial, but that enemies were quite comical. Reviews for Socks the Cat started to appear in magazines between June and July 1994, indicating the game was reaching completion. The August 1993 Nintendo Power, the official magazine of Nintendo, reported, Socks, the first feline of the land, is going to star in Kaneko's new Super NES action game. Although it sounds a bit far-fetched, the developers are having a blast putting wisecracks and visual humor in Socks the Cat. The May 1994 Nintendo Power reports, from the White House comes the inspiration for Kaneko's Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill, the story of a mild-mannered tabby who finds himself thrust into the corridors of power, where everyone wants to step on him. The highlights of this game are the comic bosses who resemble famous political figures. If Socks, with his 9 lives, makes it to the end of a stage, he'll have to deal with the likes of a stumbling President Ford or Jimmy Carter's smile attack. Your pack pundit expects the game to be released in the next few months, barring congressional action. The June 1994 Nintendo Power reports, Socks lives at 100 Pennsylvania Avenue, along with Bill and Hillary. Unlike his famous masters, Socks becomes the first Clinton with his own video game, thanks to Kaneko. In the game, it seems that a group of foreign spies has nabbed the suitcase holding the nuclear button. Pretty bad news. Luckily, Socks sees the whole dastardly deed and heads off to warn the Prez. As you might imagine, all sorts of subversive mice and other deviants try to stop Socks. What you might find harder to imagine is the Stage Guardians. Inexplicably, these characters are based on former political figures like ex-presidents, although to protect these innocents, no names are used. So why would an ex-president want to stop Socks on his mission of vital national interest? Go figure. The action in Socks is traditional hopping and bopping with 9 lives to get it right. Even around January, when I checked Wikipedia, they reported, Nintendo reportedly liked the game despite their censorship policies during the era, which condemned games with political content. Why is it controversial? Early coverage and late write-ups describe direct swipes at specific conservative or Republican figures. For example, a trade press blurb quoted by SNES Central describes an ex-KGB villain trying to set off a Rush Limbaugh, a pretty on-the-nose pun at Rush Limbaugh. Nintendo Life also notes bosses caricaturing Republican leaders like Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush. Nintendo actually really did send George W. Bush a DS Lite and Brain Age for his 60th birthday. Their letter framed it as a normal turning 60, keep your mind sharp gift, not as an insult. However, Nintendo World Report covered it with a wink, saying Nintendo sent it to sharpen his mental faculties, and then basically said they would leave the jokes to readers. Nintendo also censored some unflattering depictions of the Clintons in the Cruisin' USA game for Nintendo 64. For Atlas Obscura, Rob Stenson reports, and the article provides pictures. Have you ever completed the Nintendo 64 version of Cruisin' USA? If you have, or if you saw a friend beat it sometime in the late 90s, you may remember that the game's cross-country road race, which takes you across the Golden Gate Bridge and through a redwood forest at speeds close to 200 miles per hour, ends up in Washington, D.C., at the White House. Once you've triumphed, the camera pans upward and a farm comes into view on the White House roof. Cows and Secret Service agents surround your victorious car as it spins on a platform. This might strike you as a very subtle commentary on the Arkansan upbringing of then-President Bill Clinton, but the scene wasn't meant to be subtle. It turns out that the arcade version, Cruisin' USA, the original, has a slightly different ending. In this version, before showing the roof, the screen flashes political cartoon for a moment. And once the camera's panned up to the roof, a different cast appears. Among the Secret Service and cows sits Bill Clinton, relaxing in a hot tub placed in the back of a pickup truck. Accompanying him are 2 smiling, bouncing women in pink bikinis. One a tall-haired blonde, the other present-day Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Rodham Clinton. For those of you who've never sat down to play Cruisin', either on N64 or in an arcade, the game's premise is simple. You participate in a series of races that take you across the USA, west to east. First is San Francisco, then down the California coast, across Beverly Hills, Nebraska, Iowa, Chicago, West Virginia, finally the District of Columbia. At the height of its popularity, the game was ubiquitous in arcades and basements all across the United States. Known not only for its high-speed action, but also for its campy disregard for physics. Cruisin' USA presented an alternate reality in which school buses bounce off your car's bumper, shirtless men pump their fists at every finish line, and the soundtrack samples breathy female oohs and ahs. The track in question is House Special, though Deadwood Ride is worth a listen. But why did a game meant to thrill and titillate contain a political cartoon that, in light of Hillary Clinton's current candidacy, seems so relevant more than 20 years later? And why did Nintendo see fit to excise the scene from its home console version? The reason for the discrepancy was Nintendo's interest in editing out racy and political content for the home video game audience in 1996. The Clintons and the hot tub were gone. So too was the ability to hit and explode cows and deer at high speed. And the gyrating woman who presents a trophy after each stage, she had changed outfits from bikini top to t-shirt. Nintendo also insisted on removing a more subtle political moment from the arcade game. In the N64 version, about halfway through the DC racetrack, you pass through a tunnel whose walls are plastered with $100 bills. Pixelated Ben Franklins repeat endlessly as you scream by at 180 miles per hour. Another subtle commentary, it seems, this time on money and politics. But the arcade version had a different face grafted onto the bills. Hillary Clinton's, smoking a cigar. Once news had broken about the upcoming N64 port, infuriated gamers penned anti-censorship letters to Nintendo headquarters. At the time, Eugene Jarvis, the director of the original arcade game, vented his frustration to a game news website. "It seems like they don't have any sense of humor," he said of Nintendo. "I don't know what's wrong with those people." When I reached Jarvis earlier this week, he seemed to have cooled off. "The whole censorship thing bothered me back in the day," he wrote in an email, "but it is understandable, as Nintendo does have a strict policy against political content." He also wanted to clarify that the scene was not meant to be as politically pointed as it might seem in hindsight. "There was not really any political agenda per se," he wrote, "just having a little fun with the body politic." That said, there is some unexpected specificity to the hot tub scene. In 2011, Cruisin's lead programmer, Eric Pribble, fielded questions about Cruisin on Reddit and identified the blonde in the hot tub as Jennifer Flowers, an actress and model who had made her affair with Clinton public in 1992. In Cruisin' World, the 1996 sequel to USA, the hot tub reappears, again with Hillary and a blonde to Bill's left and right, though this time they're on the moon, for some lunar hot tub lunacy, as Jarvis put it. Hence Bill's memorable line as the tub leaves the surface of the moon, "Hold on, Hillary." And in 1999's Cruisin' Exotica, the third installment, tagline, "Get Exotic," Bill and his hot tub appear once more, though Hillary's been replaced by a cow, and the bikini blonde to his right has gone brunette. A nod to the Monica Lewinsky scandal? Jarvis wouldn't confirm it. Revisiting the Cruisin' controversy turns out to be unusually timely, not just because of another Clinton's bid for the White House. "Coincidentally, we are working on a new Cruisin' game right now," Jarvis wrote, but he downplayed the notion that a President Trump would be a natural fit for the hot tub. Trump seems a little too angry to have Bill's joie de vivre. Of course, if Trump does win the upcoming election, Jarvis could see the Trump clan enjoying themselves in the presidential hot tub in, quote, photogenic bliss, unquote. So, Nintendo is open to a pro-Clinton game in Socks the Cat, and reserved about anti-Clinton political content in Cruisin' USA. Maybe Nintendo was trying to reciprocate the positive press they received from the Clintons. The photos of Hillary Clinton playing a Game Boy are real and dated April 6th, 1993. They're in the Clinton library. Around that same time, she's on record saying she'd become quite a fan of Game Boy and that she brought her own so she wouldn't keep borrowing Chelsea's, with some of the reporting tying her addicted in the hospital remark to being at her father's bedside. Like with Lieberman, it looks like another photo op to me to associate the family with Nintendo's 90s era takeoff and success. The old Game Boy moment was even recirculated heavily in 2015 in a way that commentators explicitly framed as humanizing and relatable politics imagery. You know, one article was titled, "Hillary Clinton playing Game Boy makes an excellent desktop background." The Washington Post article was titled, "Hillary Clinton's History with Video Games and the Rise of Political Geek Cred." And another one from them said, "Hillary Clinton was a gamer in the 90s. GameSpot simply said, as if this would be an interesting article, "Here's a picture of Hillary Clinton playing Game Boy." Hillary famously even later tried to make a hip reference to Pokemon Go. She criticized young people for not voting and playing too much Pokemon Go. She said, "Pokemon go to the polls." Famously. What's interesting is that the CIA, who the Clintons have a very close connection with, could actually use Pokemon Go to direct people to the polls. I'd consider making a video on the Clinton and CIA connection, but this video alone is honestly enough to get me killed already, which I would never do to myself, by the way. In-Q-Tel, which is CIA funded, publicly announced its strategic investment in Keyhole and explicitly framed it as helping CIA and NEMA leverage resources and access tech with high value to them. Their announcement also references NEMA becoming a limited partner through CIA. Keyhole made 3D Earth visualization tech. The CIA said this would help support US troops and mapping. Google later bought Keyhole, and its product became Google Earth. CIA's own museum write-up goes further. It says CIA worked with other intelligence community organizations to tailor Keyhole's systems to meet their needs, and it explicitly ties this to the groundwork for Google Earth. Keyhole's founder, John Hanke, went on to found Niantic Labs inside Google in 2010. John Hanke's career path is documented as Keyhole, acquired by Google, then leading Google Geo products, then founding Niantic Labs inside Google and spinning it out. And major mainstream reporting describes Pokemon Go as launched by Niantic, founded by Hanke, and built on the earlier Niantic location-based work. Niantic built Field Trip, Ingress, and eventually Pokemon Go, all location-based games. Given documented CIA operational collaboration with the founding technology and founder, skepticism about Niantic's data practices and potential government interest is not paranoid. It's historically grounded. The idea that the CIA would just cut ties and walk away from Keyhole, the mapping technology it helped build, ignores the agency's entire operational playbook. The most concrete link is Gilman Louie, the former CEO and co-founder of the CIA's venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel. Louis sits on the board of directors at Niantic, and he was personally responsible for overseeing In-Q-Tel's investment in John Hankey's earlier company, Keyhole. This provides a direct channel for intelligence community influence at the highest corporate level. Niantic's own 2016 announcement says Alsop Louis invested in Niantic and that Gilman Louis would join Niantic's board, explicitly noting his experience investing in Keyhole. Alsop Louis' own site also says Louis serves on commercial and advisory boards, including Niantic and Maxar Technologies, which matters because Maxar sits directly in the geospatial defense world. The company is also publicly selling mapping data created by Pokemon Go players to defense contractors and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, the agency responsible for analyzing imagery and mapping for the U.S. military. Niantic Spatial has partnered with Vantor, a defense contractor, to create navigation for military platforms in GPS-denied environments, where jamming and spoofing takes place. This is a core national security application. On Android, Pokemon Go demands permissions for precise GPS location, network-based tracking, device accounts, contacts, full access to photos, media, files, including reading, modifying, or deleting storage, camera use, Bluetooth, and more. This setup could let the app map users' exact locations, past and present, travel routes, time spent at spots, what they're looking at, their appearance via camera, and even device contents. It's in mainstream tech and intelligence reporting. Geofencing technology can be used to control where large groups of people move in the physical world. Niantic uses lures and sponsored locations to manipulate pedestrian drift. McDonald's and Starbucks paid Niantic to turn their stores into gyms to ensure a steady stream of human foot traffic. If a corporation can sell foot traffic to a coffee shop, the technical infrastructure exists to sell or direct that same foot traffic to a polling station, a rally, or away from a sensitive government site. In 2017, Milwaukee County passed an ordinance requiring Niantic to obtain a permit to include their parks in the game because swarms of players were causing physical damage and staying past hours. Niantic recently revealed that they have been using the billions of images scanned by Pokemon Go players to build a visual positioning system, VPS. This goes beyond GPS. It allows for centimeter-level accuracy. The app has effectively turned millions of citizens into unwitting surveyors for a high-resolution 3D map of the world that was funded by CIA-linked venture capital, In-Q-Tel. Pokemon Go is an example of surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism is a market-driven economic system centered on the widespread, unilateral collection, analysis, and co-modification of personal data by corporations to predict and influence user behavior. Coined by social psychologist and philosopher Shoshana Zuboff, it treats human experience as free raw material for developing behavioral prediction products sold to business customers. Surveillance capitalism is not clean free market capitalism. In practice, it is usually state-assisted, state-managed, crony, and politically targeted, because the same platforms that extract behavioral data for profit often also serve government interests: policing, mapping, intelligence, propaganda, border control, military logistics, public space management, and population movement. Surveillance capitalism often functions as corporate-state fusion. Private companies collect, process, and monetize behavioral location data, while governments benefit from, subsidize, regulate around, purchase, or pressure access to those systems. Surveillance capitalism and its consequences for 21st century society are most fully theorized in social psychologist and philosopher Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism: The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. She summarizes it like this: surveillance capitalism is best described as a coup from above, not an overthrow of the state, but rather an overthrow of the people's sovereignty and a prominent force in the perilous drift towards democratic deconsolidation that now threatens Western liberal democracies. Harvard Business School's abstract for the age of surveillance capitalism says the system creates behavioral futures markets, subordinates production to a new means of behavioral modification, and produces a big other form of power free from democratic oversight. More directly, Zuboff argues that after 9/11, the war on terror shifted government attention away from privacy regulation and toward the technologies of Google and other surveillance capitalists, producing surveillance exceptionalism that protected the new market form from scrutiny. Citing sociologist Richard Herbert Howe, she also describes an elective affinity between public intelligence agencies and Google, where public and private interests reinforced each other. She's even clearer in her 2022 article, Surveillance Capitalism or Democracy. She writes that the U.S. response to 9/11 guaranteed continuous demand for human-generated data, and she describes a fusion scenario where the state's information appetite merges with the data supply of surveillance giants. She specifically mentions government purchase of extra-constitutional data, warrantless location tracking, app-captured location data, profiling black activists, Ring doorbell data given to law enforcement, and law enforcement acquisition of location data from the private market. And yes, it can be racialized or targeted. That is not speculative. Data systems often inherit existing social geography. If richer and whiter neighborhoods have more mapped landmarks, more user submissions, more parks, more businesses, more phones, more safe public walking spaces, and more platform attention, then location-based games can reproduce those racial and class inequalities. Pokemon Go is not merely surveillance capitalism because it collects data. It is surveillance capitalism because it turns play, family mobility, location, camera use, and public space behavior into economically valuable locative data. And that kind of data infrastructure is exactly what Zuboff warns can be purchased, demanded, partnered with, or absorbed into state and law enforcement power. Wired's discussion of Zuboff's book explicitly frames Pokemon Go as a warning example for surveillance capitalism. For Wired, journalist and visual researcher Sanjana Varghese says Pokemon Go was a colorful way to collect large amounts of data from millions of people, and it summarizes Zuboff's point as turning human behavior into raw material for prediction and behavioral shaping. Varghese also says Zuboff's book traces surveillance capitalism from Google to Pokemon Go, the Internet of Things, and beyond. Digital sociologist Michael Saker and media theory scholar Leighton Evans explicitly frame Pokemon Go through surveillance capitalism. Their chapter is literally titled Familial Locative Play, Digital Economy and Surveillance Capitalism. And the abstract says the chapter examines Pokemon Go in light of the digital economy and surveillance capitalism, using Bauman and Lyon's liquid surveillance and Zuboff's surveillance capitalism. They examine what happens when the production of locative data is treated not as leisure but as labor. The family thinks it's playing, while the platform extracts location and mobility data as economic value. Pokemon Go's map Incentives and movement patterns were built on pre-existing geospatial data and user-submitted portals that reflected unequal social geography. The result was a game that rewarded some neighborhoods more than others, and those differences tracked race and class. The Urban Institute found that in Washington, D.C., Pokestops and gyms were more plentiful in predominantly white neighborhoods. 55 portals on average in majority white neighborhoods versus 19 in majority black neighborhoods, even after controlling for population density and the share of millennials. A later academic study, The Geography of Pokemon Go, found that the game reinforced geographic biases, advantaging urban areas and neighborhoods with smaller minority populations. NYU Press describes Tara Fickle's The Race Card as arguing that games and game theory shape race formation in the United States, and it specifically opens by saying Pokemon Go reshaped neighborhood geographies and human flows by mapping the virtual onto lived realities. Its GPS map made race embedded in the game's disorienting technology, because the virtual playfield was built on unequal real-world geography, data, tourism, policing, and neighborhood access. She says that Pokemon Go is a case study in Ludo-Orientalism, where developers used GPS to make virtual spaces available for playful exploration and economic exploitation while exposing U.S. racial fault lines. NYU Press also says the book shifts away from treating games mainly as empowerment tools and toward how games are used as instruments of soft power to advance top-down political agendas. Nintendo repeatedly sat close to political power, law enforcement power, intelligence-adjacent figures, and public and private control systems. Gorton is a central bridge because he connects Nintendo's business interests, law enforcement and trade enforcement, Senate intelligence oversight, the Mariners' political rescue, and the Lieberman hearings. Gorton was not just a random senator who liked baseball. The Senate Intelligence Committee's own reporting describes the committee as responsible for oversight of intelligence activities, and Gorton appears in Senate intelligence-related proceedings from that era. He later served on the 9/11 Commission, which dealt directly with intelligence failures, terrorism, national security reform, and access to sensitive records. Gorton had intelligence community proximity. Nintendo's corporate IP interests became aligned with U.S. enforcement machinery. Customs, FBI, trade pressure, and congressional help are not ordinary just-a-toy company conditions. That is state-backed corporate protection.
Flipping Hanafuda cards, dodging all the gambling heat. Built a whole new lane, made the government retreat. 8089 vision, took it to the digital scene. Lockout, chip, tactics, yeah, you know just what I mean. Antitrust hearings, man, that's just a light flex. Putting rivals on the ropes, making power plays with checks. This ain't conspiracy, it's the playbook plain to see. From a Kyoto card deck to a global dynasty.